One of the things I've learned watching politics over the years is that political parties can become trapped inside their own success. I know that probably sounds strange because success is what every party is chasing. But I'm not talking about winning elections. I'm talking about winning your own supporters. Those are two very different things. A political base is loyal. They're with you because they already believe in your values, your direction, and your leadership. They're supposed to be difficult to lose. That's why they're called your base. The people who decide elections are different. They're the Canadians who don't automatically identify with one party. They vote Conservative one election, Liberal the next, sometimes NDP. Sometimes they don't even vote at all. They're watching from the middle, trying to figure out who understands their lives and who they trust to run the country. Those people are never won by making your own supporters happier. They're won by making people who disagree with you a little less certain that they do. And I think that somewhere along the way, political parties started to confuse those two things. This week, I was reading Brian Lilley's latest comment about Pierre Poilievre, and it struck me that we're watching something much bigger than a disagreement inside the Conservative Party. We're watching what happens when a political movement begins spending more time protecting its own coalition than building a bigger one. Because once that starts happening, the problem usually isn't messaging anymore. It's leadership. And that is what I want to talk about today.
From the headlines to what's really going on underneath. This is The Canadianist. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Here's Chris.
Hello, good day, friends, fellow Canadians. My name is Christopher M. Michaud. This is The Canadianist. Welcome to the podcast. Over the past few days, I've been watching an interesting conversation unfold inside Conservative politics. And what caught my attention wasn't a politician, it was a journalist. Brian Lilley published a column questioning whether Pierre Poilievre is focused on the right priorities. Now, what's important about that isn't the criticism itself. Political leaders get criticized every day. What's different here is that Brian Lilley has been very open about wanting Pierre Poilievre to become Canada's next prime minister. This isn't someone who's spent years opposing him. This is someone who has supported him and is now asking whether he's doing what he needs to do to win. And that matters because it tells us something about where the conversation has moved. Lilley points to several recent developments. Richard Martel has accepted a Senate appointment, meaning another Conservative MP is leaving the House of Commons. Public disagreements inside Conservative circles continue to spill out into the open. There's ongoing friction involving Doug Ford, Corey Teneycke, and members of the federal Conservative movement. At the same time, national polling continues to suggest that the Liberals have strengthened their position since the election, not weakened it. None of these stories on their own necessarily tell us very much. Politics are messy and people disagree. MPs, they leave for different reasons, and polls move up and down. That's all very normal. But there comes a point where you have to stop looking at headlines one at a time and start asking whether they're connected. I think that's where we are now. If you go back to just over a year, the Conservatives looked almost unstoppable. They held a commanding lead in the polls for months. Canadians had already started talking about Pierre Poilievre as Canada's next prime minister. Then the election arrived, and the outcome was very different. The Conservatives lost. Pierre Poilievre lost his own seat. And since then, instead of rebuilding momentum, the party has found itself answering questions about internal disagreements, departing MPs, and whether its strategy is actually expanding its support. I've been writing about this for months because I don't think these things are isolated incidents. I don't think the Calgary speech is the story. I don't think Richard Martel is the story. I don't think Brian Lilley's column is the story either. I think they're all pointing to the same underlying question. Has the Conservative Party become so focused on winning the support of its own base that it's forgotten who actually decides elections? Because that's a very different audience, and I think that's where we need to go next. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Christopher M. Michaud. This is The Canadianist. In the first segment, we were talking about Brian Lilley's column this week, and he was questioning whether he believes Pierre Poilievre is doing everything he needs to win, and we set the case a little bit. I think this is where we have to stop talking about the headlines, however, and start talking about leadership. One of the things I've always believed is that leadership isn't measured when everything is going well. Anyone can lead when the polls are climbing, donations are flowing, and everyone's patting each other on the back. The real test comes when things begin to move in the wrong direction. What does the leader do then? Do they stop and ask, what are we missing? Or do they assume everyone else just doesn't understand the message? Those are two very different paths. One leads to growth, the other usually leads to frustration. I've heard conservatives argue that Canadians just haven't heard Pierre Poilievre's message. I don't buy that for a second. Canadians have heard it. They've heard versions of it for years. If anything, Pierre Poilievre has been one of the most visible opposition leaders we've had in a long time. The problem isn't exposure. The problem is conversion. Politics isn't sales. You don't just keep repeating the same commercial until people eventually buy the product. Persuasion doesn't work that way. If someone hasn't been convinced after hearing your ideas for years, saying the same thing louder and more often doesn't usually change their mind. In many cases, it has the opposite effect. People stop listening because they don't believe anything new is being offered. That's why I keep coming back to the difference between winning your base and winning the country. Your base already believes in you. They're supposed to. That's why they're your base. They aren't the difficult part. The difficult part is earning the confidence of the people who didn't vote for you last time. The suburban family that's voted Liberal for 20 years. The union worker who used to vote NDP but is frustrated with where the country is headed. The young couple trying to buy their first home, or the newcomer who's trying to decide where they fit politically. Those are the people who decide governments. You don't persuade those Canadians by telling them they're wrong. You don't persuade them by treating every critic as an enemy. And you certainly don't persuade them by spending more time fighting people inside your own movement than you do speaking to people outside of it. You persuade them by stepping into uncomfortable conversations. You answer the difficult questions. You acknowledge concerns that don't come naturally to your own supporters. You make people who disagree with you feel like they've been heard, even if they still don't vote for you. That is leadership. And I think there's another reason why this matters. Culture always flows from the top. Every organization develops a personality. Businesses do, sports do, charities do, political parties as well. If the people inside an organization become defensive, and if disagreement starts being treated as betrayal, and if criticism is automatically dismissed as something coming from the other side, that culture didn't appear out of nowhere. It developed over time. And the leader may not create every moment, but the leader sets the tone. That's why I don't look at each departing MP as an isolated story. I don't look at every public disagreement as bad luck. And I don't look at every disappointing poll as something that can be simply explained away. I see the pattern because leadership owns those patterns. If the organization is growing, the leader deserves the credit. If the organization is shrinking, becoming more divided, or struggling to persuade new people to join it, well, the leader owns that as well. That's not a criticism of Pierre Poilievre alone. It's a principle that applies to every political party, every business, and every organization. The risk every political movement eventually risks making is believing that loyalty is the same thing as growth, and it isn't. You can have the most loyal supporters in the country and still lose an election. You can fill rally after rally with people who agree with you and still fail to convince the Canadians who actually decide who governs. That's why I think Brian Lilley's column matters, not because he criticized Poilievre, but because it reflects something larger. Even people who've strongly supported the Conservative leader are beginning to ask whether the current strategy is actually capable of building a governing coalition. That is the conversation that should have started the morning after the election. Not because Conservatives need to abandon their principles, but because every political movement has to answer the same question eventually. Are we trying to win the argument, or are we trying to win the country? Those are not the same thing. And in politics, confusing the two can keep you in opposition for a very, very long time.
You've been listening to The Canadianist. New episodes daily. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Subscribe and stay connected. The Canadianist.